Today's location is one of my favorites, and not because it's this amazing biblical location with all these references, but it's actually one of the most well-preserved archaeological sites that we can actually take part in, be in, and actually touch these different stones that are around. In the northwestern corner of the Sea of Galilee is a triangle where Jesus did most of his ministry. This spans between Capernaum, Bethsaida, and the place where we're going today. And these three locations are where Jesus did 80% of his ministry, especially in the Galilee area. This is Chorazim. Chorazim is one of the three cities in which Jesus cursed: Capernaum, Chorazim, and Bethsaida. If we can visit the other two, we'll definitely try, but this is one of my absolute favorite locations in all of Israel. But first, before we get started and looking at some of these amazing things, let me talk about just the first century cities here. Obviously, as you can see, they're made out of stone. A lot of times when we see adaptations or movies, or even in The Chosen sometimes, we see these wooden and stucco houses that wouldn't actually have been super accurate to the first century. Now, some of these houses may have been made out of stone and then had an outer coating to make them look more beautiful, but for the most part, this is what it would have looked like. These black stones that are just everywhere on the countryside here in Israel, especially in the Galilee area. So when we think about Jesus' home in the Galilee, or Peter's home in the Galilee in Capernaum, then it would look a lot more like this than we imagine it to. And that misconception goes way beyond just what the houses looked like, but think to yourself about Christmas time. And what did the manger look like? Well, would you be surprised to know that this is a manger? This is what animals would have eaten out of, because of course, if you're in this environment, you have these big black stones everywhere, you're gonna be making most of your things out of them. There's not much wood around here. Even though there's trees growing now, there probably wouldn't have been much growing at the time of Jesus. Now, as we get into talking about Chorazim in particular, a lot of what you're gonna see here is actually from the 4th century, a little bit later on in the late Roman period or the early Byzantine period, but this is still a Jewish town during that time. Now, obviously, the 1st century town would be underneath this town, and that includes the synagogue and some of the other things that we're going to look at during this video here. So I'll be going back and forth referencing the 4th century and the 1st century here as we talk about these different areas throughout Chorazim. Obviously, underneath all of this is where the city that Jesus would have visited is. One of the most amazing areas at Chorazim is this area right behind me. This is a mikveh, one of two sets basically that are sitting right here. Most likely these were two different sets, one for males, one for females, and then they would be able to cleanse themselves for the ritual things that are in Judaism. Now, this was extremely important. If you don't know what a mikveh is, this is a cleansing bath. You would walk down this set of stairs, you would cleanse yourself, and then you would walk back up the other side, showing that you've been spiritually cleansed. It was more about just getting clean. It was more than just about, making sure that you were healthy and that your body was not dirty, but that you're spiritually really clean when you're going into these certain rituals. For example, whenever you're going to synagogue, you would go into this mikveh. Whenever you're going to do specific feasts or different things like that, you have to be clean going into those. So if you're ritually unclean, you have to come in here, cleanse yourself, and then go and do whatever you're going to do. So this is one of the few places in Israel that you can actually go, see, and touch, and be a part of the history that you're looking at. Not just from afar, not just behind a pane of glass, not just behind some fencing, but right here, where it all happened. As you can see behind me, these buildings would have been obviously completed buildings for the mikveh to sit inside of, each of them for male or female. Now, this obviously would have been because when you go to a mikveh, you're going naked to go and bathe yourself for these ritual cleansings. And when Jesus did this, it wasn't because he was actually, spiritually unclean, but rather that he was ritually unclean, meaning that he probably at some point touched like a dead animal or raw meat, or he touched blood or bodily fluids, right? Meaning that in the Jewish society, he was unclean and needed to use the mikveh before he went into the synagogue or did anything else within the faith there. So here we're seeing all these buildings here and how they're unfinished, obviously now after many earthquakes and time destroying them. But some of these have been able to be rebuilt or restored in order for us to see what they would have looked like during their time and exactly where they were as well. This is really, really a cool experience. Chorazim really is one of my favorite, if not my favorite place in all of Israel. But if you want to experience Chorazim and many other locations which are just fantastic to be a part of, then you can go to Israel with us in December. If you're thinking about going on this trip with us, you can save your spot by using your phone to scan this QR code and registering for $500 to save your spot. Every other trip that I'm seeing right now to Israel is at least $5,000, $6,000, or maybe even $7,000 just for the base price of the trips. This trip is $3,900, and that's as cheap as I could possibly get it to be the most affordable trip to Israel this year. I'd love for you to be a part of it, and I can't guarantee that our next trip will have the same great price. So don't wait, save your spot, and we'll see you in Israel in December. Let's get back to the video. As I'm sure I'll say several times in all of these videos, one of the most amazing things about Israel is that it is ever changing. So if you came here 10 years ago, it is vastly different than what it is now. In fact, many things have been discovered in just the last few years. For example, I was here a year ago, just barely over a year ago, and this entire space is completely different than it was before because they were doing active excavations during that time. So we actually got to see how things were unfolding in real time. It was really amazing. Now behind me right here is a large paved courtyard along with several dwelling places. This would have been either one gigantic house. I don't think that's what it was. I think it was several houses over here. And then over here we have a large paved courtyard for people to come out and to have different festivities there. It's really interesting to see that they would have a courtyard like this. I wonder how much Roman influence was in there versus Jewish influence and what actually happened here in the city. It's hard to know all of that stuff, but what we can know is that this existed right here, and this is where people actually lived. One of the major reasons why it's so cool that we have ruins like this is because it gives us a better understanding of how these people lived during their time. For example, this door right here, this is the door to a dwelling behind it. Why is it so small? Well, we have to ask ourselves these questions when we come upon things that are so abnormal like this. This would have been normal during the time, but for us in modern day, it doesn't make any sense as to why this door would be so small. So we have to ask ourselves questions like, were they just this small? Were they 3 feet tall and they had the doorways like that? That's why they built it so small? Well, no, the doorway would have been this small, but most likely the buildings would have been much taller. As you can see behind me, there's other walls that are much, much taller than this door. And we see other buildings all throughout the Jewish society that are much, much bigger and obviously not 2 or 3 feet tall, right? And our skeleton records also show us exactly how tall these people were as well, right? So this could be for a couple of different reasons, but one of those reasons is for defense. It would make this really hard to enter this building attacking the people inside with weapons and armor. You'd have to crouch down and kind of get inside. You'd be really vulnerable, especially if you're going head first into a building. So from the inside, it makes it really easy to defend as well. And to the left side of this dwelling, you can actually see that clearly this is still under archaeological excavation. So actively, they're working on this site right now. That means if you were to come here later this year or next year, this may be open to you to walk into, and they could have found new things here. Who knows what is hiding under the ground here? There could be an inscription from some important person, or one of the apostles could have visited here and told us something that we didn't know before. There's so many really cool things that could corroborate things from the Bible that could be really anywhere here. So it's so exciting to see these archaeological excavations being done all over the place. Now this to me is probably the crown jewel of Chorazim. This is the synagogue, and underneath this is where the 1st century synagogue would have stood during the time of Jesus. Remember, most of these buildings that you're seeing here are from the late 3rd to early 4th century AD. And we're going to talk about how it was restored and what's kind of going on over here. But there's a huge hint here as to why Jesus would curse this city. And it's really interesting the more that you look into it. But let's check out this synagogue because it's one of the most amazing finds and one that you can actually walk into and be a part of. Man, I love Chorazim. This right here is the corner of the ancient synagogue, and you can clearly see that they're restoring this piece of it right here. This is a common thing that you'll see done in 1st century areas, or really any area, whether it's Byzantine, Crusader, or anything else. You can see them restoring pieces of this as to preserve it and show you the shape of the actual building. But clearly, there's a differentiation between the black stone and the white stone here that is newer than the original here. So you can see the original black stone is pretty much everywhere over here. These stones are actually in really, really good shape. And these white stones right here are a restoration of what is actually going on to show you how tall this building would have been, to show you what it would have looked like. And of course, they wouldn't do the entire building like this because they want to preserve as much of it as possible so that it's as original and authentic as possible as well. Now, no matter how amazing this synagogue and this city actually is, Jesus still cursed it. And why is that? Well, in scripture, we read that he cursed it because he did so many miracles. He did so many things in this area to prove that he was the Messiah, and yet they still didn't believe. They still walked away from him. And so they were cursed because they, out of everybody, should have been the ones that believed in him, and yet they didn't. And that includes Capernaum, Chorazim, and Bethsaida. These 3 cities no longer exist in a modern sense. There is no modern city of Chorazim. It just doesn't exist because they were cursed and destroyed. And I think that there are definitely hints here as to why that could be. For example, look at these different details on the synagogue building top. On top of this building were details that really resemble resemble Roman architecture, and not only in the way that they're designed and the way that they look, but also the characters that they use. For example, on this first century synagogue, look at what's behind me. Right here, we have this detail with a face and then lines going all around the outside of the face. This is a resemblance of Medusa, one of the Greek Gorgons, a mythological creature. So imagine what kind of influence the Roman culture had on this area in particular. We see symbols just like this in Roman architecture and Roman ruins, but to see it here, in a city that Jesus was often a part of, it's hard to kind of swallow, you know? But you can definitely see where that downfall started and who these people may have become. You can see once we get inside that this is about 4, 5, maybe 6 times as big as the one in Magdala, and you can actually go inside this and interact with a lot of things going on. They've done a lot of work to restore this location, and this is a little bit different philosophy than what we have over in Magdala. Magdala is more of an excavation, it's just kind of showing you what was there. There's parts of that here, but in this specific building, they're actually restoring it, using the stones that were originally used and putting them back in place in order to show you what this would have looked like. For example, the top of this building right over here, that obviously is not on the top, but it's reconstructed down here in order to show you what it would have looked like, and that would have been up above on the building. Now, any of you builders out there are going to be really confused by this set of stairs. This is obviously not a very well-made set of stairs, or so you would think at first glance. But in actuality, remember that these stairs are leading to the synagogue. So just like the temple in Jerusalem, which we'll talk about later, these steps are intentionally misaligned, and they're different sizes for each step. And that is because they don't want you to walk unmindfully into the synagogue. They want you to be very intentional and focused. And so in order to help you to do that, these stairs are different heights. So you can never get in the muscle memory rhythm of going up these stairs quickly or running into the synagogue. You would have to slowly take each step and understand where each step is, otherwise you would trip and fall. This was extremely intentional for most synagogues, and especially the temple in Jerusalem. Now let me show you what's on the inside and where Jesus would have taught here in Chorazim. Then I'll also show you one of the most amazing finds ever found in any site in Israel, and it has a direct tie to scripture. After visiting the mikveh and cleansing themselves, they would obviously come into here and receive a teaching from the rabbi, and this is probably the Beit Midrash as well. Students would come in here to learn and to talk about the Torah, to argue and fight about certain theological issues. There's so many things that I'm sure happened in this room. One of the most important things, probably the most important thing, is that Jesus was here. Most likely speaking to a crowd right over here and speaking about what is to come, the kingdom of heaven, and giving them the words of truth. And yet they didn't listen. That's why this city is cursed. They didn't hear what he had to say. I mean, can you imagine hundreds of people packed in here listening to Jesus speak, or another rabbi? They're talking about the Torah. They're arguing about certain things. The Pharisees from all over are coming to see what is happening here. Just like in Magdala, you can actually see that the benches on the sides of the walls is where they would sit. Much different than what we have today with, our chairs or our pews or whatever else in a church service. And so this is where they would have sat. You can also see the reconstruction here of the new seats versus the old seats, and how well the old seats have actually held up for the ones that weren't either crumbled or misplaced. Overall, you can see how beautiful and magnificent this building would have been 2,000 years ago. If you want to see a full walkthrough of this entire site here at Chorazim, then you can go over to our Patreon at snipesupport.com, and there's a whole, I think, 32-minute video of us walking through the entire place and explaining every little thing. Now, there are some other things that they actually found in this room. Other than these decorative pillars and different things, they also found a decorative column that was probably a part of the Ark of Law, and that is where they would hold all the scrolls for the synagogue. But the most important thing that they found was actually something called the seat of Moses. This is something that's mentioned in scripture, but we really didn't know what it looked like or what it was until we found it here in Chorazim. Now, this is mentioned in scripture. Jesus talks about those who sit on the Moses seat, and this is often thought to be the seat of one of the most important people within the synagogue. This was held for nobility or very famous people that were coming to the synagogue to visit. And so they would sit here and they would have, a place of honor within the synagogue. Jesus talks about it in this verse right here. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. While some people will argue that this is a metaphor, some people will say this is a physical seat, and this is what Jesus was talking about. As always, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. This was a seat that was used during the time of Jesus that obviously shows this was someone of importance, right? But it also was a metaphor, clearly talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were the leaders of the law during the time of Jesus. Now, this one in particular is actually a replica. The real one is in the Israel Museum, so maybe we'll see that in a later video. To be completely honest, there's much too much to show you in one sitting here in Chorazim. There's a lot of things to show you, including this house that I'm next to right now, an olive press, a wine press, and of course, all the other things that we looked at in this video. But the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about was this path right behind me. This is the same or similar path that Jesus would have taken from Capernaum to Chorazim every single time he came here. This would have been the way that he traveled throughout this area, and these are the things that he would have seen. These hills are the same hills, these rocks are the same rocks, this weather is the same weather. And so we can see that Jesus took inspiration from a lot of these different things in order to tell the parables that the people during his time would understand. That includes the parable of the sower. On our trip last year, we brought Brandon Robbins and David Tate, and Brandon Robbins did the teaching at this spot, Chorazim, since he was the only one that had been here before. And one of the things that he taught us about this path is that this may have been the place that Jesus took inspiration for the parable of the sower. Imagine you're walking along the path and you see these different plants growing all around. I can see them all around me right now. You see the thorns and the thistles, you see the stones and the rocks, you see how the sun could bake down and really take advantage of these plants that aren't ready to grow in their natural environment. You see how these things can crop up and be taken advantage of, but then you see the plants that are planted in good soil, and you see how they thrive and how they grow and how beautiful they are. These are the same exact things that Jesus would have used as inspiration for his parables as he spoke to the people of the Galilee. Of course, he's using their environment to relate to them, just like I do here on YouTube. It's my mission to be able to use the things in real life to be able to relate to you and then teach you about scripture or other things beyond that. So here I am in Chorazim, the same place that Jesus was, the same area that he lived, worked, and taught. And now we're seeing exactly what he would have seen. I wish I could spend 10 hours here and show you absolutely everything. But the truth is, I just don't have that time. I have other sites I need to go to and other things I need to do. And quite frankly, it's above 85 degrees and burning hot out here today. So we want to do the best that we possibly can with the time that we have allotted in each space, and I hope you've really enjoyed this video. And if you've learned something or you really enjoyed this video, it would help us out a ton if you would subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend. Let them know what we're doing here in Israel and to follow along with our series. It's been a ton of fun, and we're going to continue on for quite a while from here. So hit that like button and check out this Israel video if you haven't seen it already. We'll see you on the next one. Peace.